Saudi Arabia is running out of oil. Now, I know that from the very beginning, when I go ahead and say that a lot of people are going to be shocked because variations of this phrase have been said over the years, but simultaneously, it's not ever really something that people believed until going into recent years. Because when I go ahead and say that is something that is truly mind-boggling, because when you go and think of Saudi Arabia, you think of two things. You think of sand and you think of oil. And it's for a very good reason that you actually think that, because Saudi Arabia possesses approximately 17% of the entire world's proven petroleum reserves, and from that, ranks as one of the largest net exporters of petroleum. In fact, Saudi Arabia has the second largest proven oil reserves in the world, being second only behind Venezuela. But the stuff that comes out of Venezuela isn't nearly as good of quality, and because of how difficult it is to extract, means that the stuff out of Saudi Arabia technically makes that the greatest exporter of petroleum. And if you're wondering just how large of an oil amount that we're talking about here, Saudi Aramco, one of the world's largest integrated energy and chemical companies, is the state-owned oil company for Saudi Arabia, and it brings in a truly ludicrous amount of wealth. How much wealth, you may be wondering? Oh boy, check this out. Hello my friends, Takuya here, and I'm going to let you get back to the video. I'm sorry for interrupting that, but I wanted to give you a heads up that this May I am leading a trip to Italy, and unfortunately we did have some last minute cancellations just now, but because of that, that now means that there are a few spots open for the trip. So if you want to go on an adventure with me, if you want to go to Rome, if you want to go to Florence and see these ancient Roman sites and have a fun adventure, then by all means click the link down in my description, because I'm going to be leading this trip soon and it's going to be a lot of fun, and I can't wait to see you there. Over the course of 2022, the oil giant Aramco reported that it earned $161 billion in profit. That is claiming the highest ever recorded annual profit by a publicly listed company in history. And if you're wondering why it was capable of making such an absolutely ludicrous amount of money, the answer is Russia and its invasion of Ukraine. The reason for this being is that after Russia would launch its invasion in February of 2022, the sanctions that would be placed on Moscow would limit its oil and natural gas industry in Western markets, and that meant that all of that profit was capable of going towards Saudi Arabia and others. The profit that we are talking about here, for the amount of money that they would make, is equal to $688 million per day. And that's not in sales, that is in profit. And if you're wondering at this point where all of that ludicrous amount of wealth is going, the answer is pretty much directly to the Saudi government. Because the Saudi government and the Public Investment Fund, or PIF, as we're going to be calling it over the course of this video, it's a sovereign wealth fund which owns more than 98% of Saudi Aramco, which makes the company, through the dividends and taxes that it pays, a major source of the kingdom's income. Its wealth, its influence, its power, everything. I mean, I just want you to imagine right now, what if Walmart in the United States was responsible for 40% of your entire GDP? That is the level of power and wealth that we are talking about here. And if you were looking for examples of what exactly this wealth does, then you're going to find no better examples than the royal family of the House of Saud. Which, yes, Saudi Arabia, House of Saud. That is where the name comes from of the country. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Saudi royal family, this is probably something that I could do an entire video on in and of itself, but the House of Saud is something that has been the ruling dynasty of Saudi Arabia since the country was first established back in 1932. And over time, the Saudi royal family has verified itself as one of the world's wealthiest and most powerful families. And if you think for a second that they are going to hide that wealth and how powerful they actually are, then my friends, I don't know what it is that you're on, but you should probably get off of that, because their luxury is extremely conspicuous and obvious. As is probably expected from royals, and especially in the case of the Saudis, every single time they travel, they will don the priciest labels with the largest entourages that they possibly can get and stay in the highest end of hotels. If there was ever an image that you could have to describe immense wealth and power, it would probably be something that would star a Saudi royal. And actually, on that note, before we continue, there is something that I should go ahead and state. The House of Saud, as we're talking about, is not just a royal family, it is something that comprises the entire Saud clan, something along the lines of 15,000 people. And what's noteworthy about this is that only 2,000 of those individuals actually hold a large amount of wealth, which is estimated to be worth $1.4 trillion. Even fewer of these individuals actually play an active role in politics and the government and anything like that. And to get an idea of what it is that I'm talking about, to put things into perspective, the House of Saud is worth approximately 16 times more than the British royal family, which is estimated to be worth around $88 billion. The current king of Saudi Arabia, whose name I'm going to try to pronounce here, Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, and the crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, are extraordinarily wealthy in and of themselves, though their net worth income from among that $1.4 trillion is not actually something that is disclosed. We don't don't actually know how much they are in fact worth. But many people speculate that Muhammad, who is pretty much the de facto ruler of the country, is worth an approximate $25 billion by himself. And I mean, just check this out as an example. Yes, the House of Saud owns properties worth fortunes all around the world, but one of the biggest ones that they have is the Al Yamama Palace, something that serves as the official residence and office of the King of Saudi Arabia. And this thing is absolutely insane. The palace was built back in 1983, and it spans a whopping 4 million square feet. Every square inch of this thing is covered in Italian marble floors, and also intricately carved ceilings and wall panels. The palace has approximately a whopping 1,000 rooms with unmatched amenities inside of it. We're talking its own movie theater, it has a mosque, it has a bowling alley, it has multiple swimming pools, mind you, and all of this is just one palace that is owned by the king. Because there are others that are equally as crazy, such as the Palace of Al-Ajah, which is a retreat place for King Salman, where he goes and receives a number of foreign dignitaries, presidents, kings, etc. And besides that, you have another one, which is the Erga Palace, something that is used for entertaining Saudi VIPs, as well as a venue for government functions, state receptions, and cultural festivals. This is actually one that was visited by former US President Barack Obama and his entourage, and when this happened, the Saudi king went all out, treating the foreign officials to lobster, to lamb, jeweled rice, and much more. According to CBS News, reporters were also spotting gold-plated Kleenex dispensers alongside gold chairs. Which I'm going to say this right now. Gold Kleenex. Gold Kleenex. That is wealth. And from traditional Islamic art to world-renowned contemporary artwork, the family is exceptionally enthusiastic about art. They would leave absolutely no stone unturned to acquire the world's most expensive, insane paintings and make galleries that would honor it. If you have ever seen the painting behind me here, the Salvator Mundi, this is one of the most famous works by Leonardo da Vinci, and the Crown Prince, Muhammad, got into a bidding war with Qatari rivals to take this painting for a whopping $450 million, which is a lot to pay for a single piece of art. And another very famous artwork that is in their possession is Pablo Picasso's Les Femmes d'Alger, which I know that I'm not actually showing that up here right now, but considering that that has nudity in it, even though it's, of course, a Pablo Picasso work, I don't know exactly whether or not that's something that would end up being taken down by YouTube, but still, it was bought for a whopping $160 million in 2015, which is, again, a lot. And I mean, beyond the palaces, beyond the properties, beyond the paintings that we're talking about here, the wealth of this clan is something that there isn't exactly a public number. It is something that can only really be estimated by what it is that we are able to glimpse, the assets that we can actually see. And the stationary palaces of the Saudi royals are extremely grand, but the floating palaces that they have are truly insane. And as an example of that, what you can see behind me here is Prince Mohammed bin Salman's $400 million super yacht, the Serene. This 439-foot yacht features a giant internal seawater pool. It has 2 helipads. It has a snow room, children's playrooms, and even an underwater viewing room. But in fact, the wealthiest thing about this boat is not actually the boat itself. It is the fact that the painting that we talked about earlier, the $450 million Salvator Mundi, is actually kept on this yacht, meaning the painting on the yacht is more valuable than the yacht itself. Another yacht that is in their possession is the Prince Abdulaziz, which at 482 feet was one of the largest yachts to ever be built in the 21st century. This truly massive yacht is capable of sleeping 64 guests inside of 32 massive staterooms and accommodating a crew of 65 people. And even though this thing has a much smaller price tag of $100 million, the Prince Abdulaziz simultaneously boasts extremely luxurious amenities like a well-equipped gym, a sauna, a beauty salon, a cinema, and a swimming pool. The yacht is actually owned by King Abdullah himself as part of his inheritance that he got from King Fahad, and the vessel, allegedly, simultaneously carries surface-to-air missiles and an underwater surveillance system for protection, which if you're the Saudis, you kind of probably need. And in addition to all of these yachts, the family simultaneously owns a fleet of private jets, flaunting some of the most luxurious and advanced aircraft in the world for their private travel needs. And the greatest example that I could probably give of that is that inside of this massive fleet, there is a Boeing 747-400, the largest commercial plane in the world that was transformed into a luxurious mini mansion of the skies. We're talking something that was complete with furnishings, with plush seats, fine carpets, exquisite artwork, everything that a Saudi royal would need while traveling, because naturally, of course. The plane would also feature a spacious lounge area, several bedrooms, multiple bathrooms with gold-plated fixtures, and the renovations were estimated to cost approximately $50 million, which is a lot of money. again, but guess what? This ultra luxurious plane ended up being scrapped after a mere 16 flights. The guy that this plane was meant for in the first place, Crown Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, ended up dying only a few months before it was meant to be delivered. And so this absolute luxurious star of the sky ended up sitting abandoned for a decade with just no one to have it. And if you think that that is funny and also a massive waste of money, you're gonna like this next part. I'm sure that a number of you watching this right now, you probably recognize this image because it was pretty famous on the internet a few years back, but a member of the Saudi royal family once purchased individual seats for 80 of his Falcons. That's right, on a flight, he purchased 80 seats, each one for his individual Falcon. 80 Falcons. That means that he essentially booked out the entire United Arab Emirate flight just because he loved falconry so much. Now, that all being said, I know that I've gone on about this for quite a while, and I could go on even longer about the sheer wealth and power of the Saudi royal family, at least for the next hour or so. But that would end up detracting from the overall point that I'm trying to make right now, and I want you all to understand this. The amount of wealth that Saudi Arabia has, the amount that they are able to simply throw around, all of this comes from oil, and it has allowed them over the years to be so incredibly wasteful. They are so wealthy that they can waste whatever insane amount they want on any number of frivolous activities because in the end, there's always been more money. There's always been more oil, but that appears to be changing. And so now, before we go and address that, we need to explain how exactly it is that we got here in the first place and explain some of the history of Saudi Arabia, because you can't understand the present without first understanding the past, and on the history of everything, that is precisely what we need to do. When we talk about the history of Saudi Arabia is the location of the birth of the Prophet Muhammad for Islam, this having occurred around 570 AD in Mecca, and from this, it makes it one of the most holy sites in all of Islam. What Muslims believe is that God, or Allah as they would say, sent his final revelation in the form of the Holy Quran, and through his messenger, Muhammad. This would occur first in and around Mecca, and then from there in Medina, beginning around 622 AD, which marks the first year of the Islamic era, or 1 AH. By the time Muhammad died in Medina in 632, almost all of the communities in Arabia had declared loyalty to him as a political leader, and also to Islam as a religion. Muslims view Muhammad not as a creator of a new religion, but rather as the restorer of the original uncorrupted monotheistic faith of Adam, Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. Yes, for those of you who are not aware, Jesus is not viewed negatively within Islam. Jesus is viewed as simply another prophet rather than the Son of God, like in the case of Christianity. Islam's first caliph, Abu Bakr, would complete the process of conversion, and Arabian converts would carry the religion throughout the Middle East as well as North Africa. The rise of Islam and the subsequent religious importance of the Arabian cities of Mecca and Medina, two of the holiest places in all of Islam, would give the rulers of this territory significant influence beyond the peninsula. And this detail that I'm talking about here is extremely important because before oil was ever discovered in Saudi Arabia, the primary thing that drove the economy of the region, and this being even before Saudi Arabia ever existed in the first place, was specifically tourism. It was when Muslims had to perform the Hajj to actually go to Mecca, and from this they would be able to sell all different kinds of goods, from foodstuffs, travel supplies, etc., and this was a huge form of income for the area. The sheer amount of religious and political clout that owning these two holy sites gives Saudi Arabia is something that makes Saudi Arabia go and declare itself to be the leader of the Muslim world. Something that is quite contentious to other Muslim nations, but still, that is something that they push. Fast forward a little bit of time, and the first Saudi state, as we would imagine it, would be established in 1744. This being when leader Sheikh Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab would settle in Dirya, and Prince Muhammad ibn Saud would agree to support and espouse his cause. And this is extremely important for the development of Saudi Arabia and its cultural and political ideology, because after studying in the Hijaz and Iraq, Sheikh Muhammad al-Abd al-Wahhab, who died in 1792, would return to Najd and would preach and write against practices that deviated from Islam. He urged his followers, who became known as Unitarians, to end polytheistic practices and to adhere strictly to the Quran and the Hadith, which are sayings and doings of the Prophet. A new leadership structure would place al-Saud in the position of Umara, or the prince or ruler, and al-Abd al-Wahhab, also known as al-Sheikh, would be in the position of ulama, or learned in religion. And so the movement that these two would create would involve military struggle. It would involve preaching, the establishment of Quranic schools, and the setting up of new communities and the creation of a bureaucratic state that that would effectively rule in Najd. The House of Saud, with other allies, would end up rising to become the dominant state in Arabia, controlling most of the internal territory, but not either of the coasts. Which is actually all well and good, and this Saudi state would last for approximately 75 years. But when you have a rising power by your border, this is not typically something that many states take kindly to, and growing concerned at the power that was growing with the Saudis, the Ottoman Sultan instructed Muhammad Ali Pasha to go and reconquer the area. Ali would send his sons, Tusan Pasha and Ibrahim Pasha, who were successful and would rout the Saudi forces in 1818. However, the House of Saud would not be gone for long, and eventually they would return to power with the second Saudi state in 1824. This state would last until 1891, when it would ultimately succumb to the Al-Rashid dynasty of Hayil. Still though, the Saudis were not going to disappear, and in the year 1902, Abdul Aziz ibn Saud would capture Riyadh, which is the Al Saud dynasty's ancestral capital and the current capital of Saudi Arabia, from the rival Al-Rashid family. Continuing his conquests, Abdul Aziz would subdue Al-Hassa, the rest of Nejd, the Hijaz between 1913 and 1926, and from that would establish and dominate the region. On January 8th, 1926, Abdul Aziz ibn Saud would officially become the King of Hijaz, and on January 29th, 1927, he would take the title King of Nejd. His previous Neji title was Sultan, and now he would declare himself to be king. By the Treaty of Jeddah, signed on May 20th, 1927, the United Kingdom would recognize the independence of Abdulaziz's realm, then known as the Kingdom of Hijaz and Nejd, and in 1932, these regions would be unified as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And so, after going through that brief history of Saudi Arabia, one comes to understand that the House of Saud, that the Saud clan, is something that over the course of many, many years and much warfare managed to conquer and subdue all the varying different tribes within Saudi Arabia, a state that still to this day has many different tribal and familial divisions. Now, normally, when one is talking about tribal divisions, the sheer amount of divisions that would occur within a country like this, something that is created out of conquest, will usually lead to many years of trouble afterwards, as varying different tribal groups try to break apart as they don't see themselves as being part of a national identity. That is the state that Saudi Arabia probably would have entered into if not for the discovery of something in 1938 that would completely change the state forevermore. Can you guess what I'm talking about? Oh, that's right, my friends. It's oil. The discovery of oil on March 3rd, 1938 is something that effectively would transform the country. Development programs, which had been delayed due to the onset of the Second World War in 1939, would begin in earnest in 1946. And by 1949, full production of oil was in full swing. Over the decades, oil would go on to provide Saudi Arabia with massive amounts of economic prosperity, and from that, a great deal of leverage in the international community. But weirdly enough, despite the fact that Saudi Arabia, from its oil, would have massive amounts of international leverage, internationally, Abdulaziz initially chose to follow more of an isolationist policy. He refused to allow Saudi Arabia to join the League of Nations, and he chose to leave his kingdom only 3 times from 1916 all the way until his death in 1953. For the rest of that, he was within the country and didn't care about what happened outside of it. Still though, the man was not stupid and would eventually come to understand that Saudi Arabia could not simply close itself off from the outside world. And so it was then in 1945 that Saudi Arabia would not only join the United Nations, but simultaneously become a founding member of the Arab League. At the same time, regarding politics, the king was well aware of the difficulties that were facing other regional absolute rulers, ones who were entirely dependent upon extended family networks. So Abdulaziz would take steps to provide that his eldest living son, Saud, would become king, but that he would be required to work closely with his more financially and diplomatically intelligent brother, Faisal. And so it was then that Saud would ascend to the throne upon his father's death in 93, and after that would reign for 11 years. The issue then became is that by the early 1960s, the kingdom was in jeopardy due to Saud's severe economic mismanagement and also his failure to deal with a regional challenge coming from Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser. Because of the fiscal difficulties that were faced, King Saud had been persuaded then in 1958 to delegate direct control of Saudi government affairs to his half-brother Faisal as prime minister. Then, in October of 1962, Faisal would outline a broad reform program, something that would stress economic developments. By 1964, Saud was then forced to abdicate in favor of Faisal, who would continue to serve as prime minister. Subsequent kings would continue to follow this practice. And so it was then, my friends, that moving into the 1960s, this this is where things get really complex for Saudi Arabia and its neighbors, because a series of conflicts would end up breaking out during this time. And the first of these conflicts was going to occur in Yemen, which, yes, I understand the irony of that considering how much is going on in Yemen right now. In today's day and age, this is not the first time that Saudi Arabia has been involved in any of this stuff. When civil war broke out in 1962 between Yemeni royalists and Republicans, Egyptian forces would enter Yemen in order to support the new Republican government, while Saudi Arabia would go and back the royalists. Tensions would only subside after 1967, when Egypt would withdraw its troops from Yemen. In 1965, there was a bit of a political and territorial exchange between Saudi Arabia and Jordan, in which Jordan went and gave up a relatively large area of in desert in return for a small piece of seashore near Aqaba. Fast forward a little bit of time, and Saudi forces did not actually participate in the Six-Day War that would occur between Arab states and Israel in June of 1967, but the government would later provide annual subsidies to Egypt, Jordan, and Syria in order to try and support their economies. However, that all being said, during the Yom Kippur War of 1973, Saudi Arabia would participate in the Arab oil boycott of the United States as well as the Netherlands. As a member of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, Saudi Arabia had joined other member countries in moderate oil price increases beginning in 1971. And after 1973, when the war would break out, the price of oil would rise substantially, which, from that, would dramatically increase Saudi Arabia's wealth and political influence in the region. And so it is into this era of new power and influence that a new king would end up taking the stage in Saudi Arabia. In 1975, King Faisal was assassinated by a nephew and was then succeeded by his half-brother Khalid as king and prime minister. Their half-brother, Prince Fahd, was then named crown prince and first deputy prime minister. King Khalid would then empower Crown Prince Fahd to oversee many aspects of the government's affairs. Economic development would continue rapidly during this time under King Khalid, and the kingdom would assume a more influential role in regional politics, as well as international economic and financial matters. Still though, King Khalid wouldn't necessarily rule for all that long, and in June of 1982, he would die. And subsequently from that, King Fahd would then come into power and become prime minister in a rather smooth transition. Another half-brother, Prince Abdullah, who was the commander of the Saudi National Guard, was then named as crown prince and first deputy prime minister. And it is under King Fahd that the Saudi economy would have to start to adjust to sharply lower oil revenues resulting from declining global oil prices. And if you are wondering about how severe of a drop we are talking about here and how badly that can shock the economy, keep in mind that in the year 2004, Saudi Arabia was on average per person earning about $4,564 from oil. But back in 1980, that number was $22,589. Like you can see right here, this is a pretty big drop. And so it is into this period of financial uncertainty that in August of 1990, Saddam Hussein's forces would go and invade Kuwait. Iraqi troops began massing on the border of Kuwait, and some had feared that when this happened, that they were also going to invade Saudi Arabia. Because of this, King Fahd would actually allow American and coalition soldiers to be stationed in Saudi Arabia in order to try and counter the Iraqi threat. Many Muslims during this time period ended up being angered by this move, because it is something that allowed foreign armies to be stationed in the holiest land of Islam. This would in turn later lead to a number of them to declare a holy war on the United States and the West, but the details of that I'm not going to go into or show images of because this is YouTube and really who knows what exactly is going to end up being taken down. So while we are not going to be getting into that, King Fahd would suffer a stroke in November of 1995 and would ultimately die 10 years later in July of 2005. He would be succeeded by his brother Crown Prince Abdullah, who would handle most of the day-to-day operations of the government. Over the course of this time period, despite growing calls for change, King Abdullah would continue the policy of moderate reforms. Not necessarily doing anything too crazy, but simultaneously trying to modernize the state, at least to a degree. He pursued a policy of limited deregulation, of privatization, of seeking foreign investment, and in December of 2005, following 12 years of talks, the World Trade Organization would give the green light to Saudi Arabia's membership. And as oil prices began to rise once again in the mid-2000s, things were starting to look pretty good for Saudi Arabia. And then, my friends, everything went to crap when the Arab Spring would erupt in 2011. Now, I'm not going to be going into the details of this event. That is something that definitely on its own deserves an entire video in and of itself, but the short of it is that from the unrest that would spread all across the Middle East over the course of the early 2010s, this is something that would create many different problems for a number of rulers that would try to at least adhere some degree of control over their populace. And the way that Saudi Arabia did this was by very quickly announcing an increase in welfare spending. No political reforms were announced as part of this package, and if you would like a video on just how restrictive Saudi Arabia is and what it is that they had to do during this time period, definitely let me know in the comment section below, because that is something that I would love to to do, but it's a massive can of worms. Either way, at the same time that welfare was being increased within the country in order to pacify the population, Saudi troops were also being sent to participate in the crackdown and unrest in Bahrain. King Abdullah would give asylum to the deposed president Zine El Abidine Ben Ali of Tunisia, and would also telephone President Hosni Mubarak of Egypt, prior to him being deposed, in order to offer support. Abdullah would also, during this time period, grant women the right to vote in municipal elections. So hey, that's something. As all of this is going down, King Abdullah would die in 2015, and his half-brother Salman would become the new king, very quickly reorganizing the government and abolishing several bureaucratic departments. Salman is the individual that is the current reigning king of Saudi Arabia, and he is the individual that would involve Saudi Arabia in the Second Yemeni Civil War and name his son Mohammed bin Salman as crown prince in 2017. It is actually since 2017, since that moment, that Mohammed has been assisting his father in the government, and from that, de facto running the country. In fact, one of the things that this guy did is that shortly after becoming crown prince, he would go and detain 200 princes and businessmen in the Ritz-Carlton in Riyadh, stating that this was a move to prevent corruption in Saudi Arabia. The man is not afraid to use whatever power he deems necessary in order to help his country, however it is that he sees fit. And it is here, my friends, under Mohammed bin Salman, that much of what we are trying to talk about today with Saudi Arabia, its economy, all the changes that are taking place, it is he who is responsible for all of it, as he is the one who is leading Saudi Vision 2030, a plan that is meant to diversify the country's economy and move Saudi Arabia away from being entirely dependent on oil revenue. You see, my friends, the Saudi state is very heavily dependent upon the revenue that it obtains from exporting primarily oil, although to some extent this also does apply to natural gas as well as petrochemicals. And this, in the past, has contributed to, depending upon the year that we're talking about here and also the price of oil, around 85% of the entire state's budget, which is a ludicrous amount. And so you have to understand that with a budget that is so heavily dependent on the price of oil, that means that any kind of fluctuations, anything that possibly occurs in price of oil, like what goes on here, then that is very bad news for Saudi Arabia. But what makes this issue even more significant is the fact that Saudi Arabia is very different from what we would imagine a standard economy to be. Allow me to explain. For the majority of the world, when you talk about an economy is something in which people produce things and then the government taxes them on those things. That's how governments typically operate and function. That's where they get their revenues from to be able to govern in the first place. But in Saudi Arabia, the government does not actually tax people. Instead, what it does is give them a large amount of services and welfare state options that specifically are fueled by the sale of oil. So, the lower the price of oil, the less money the state has to spend on this welfare that it needs in order to keep its people happy. Thus it is then that the state of Saudi Arabia, that the economy, that everything that it does, it's not actually a productive state. It doesn't produce anything. Instead, it merely distributes the wealth that it obtains. And as for the level of that wealth, again, that is something that is entirely dependent upon the price of oil. And so considering what it is that we're talking about here, it's really no surprise that for decades, Saudi Arabia was the largest producer of oil in the world, and to this day is currently the world's second largest producer, just barely behind the United States. Alongside Russia, these three countries, when you combine them, are collectively known as the Big Three of global oil production. Because, my friends, in comparison to those three, there is no other country that even comes close to producing as much oil as they do. And if you actually went and combined them, these three countries alone are responsible for producing half of all of the oil in the world. But, that all being said, there's a very key difference as to why, say, America does not have the same kind of economic setup as what Saudi Arabia does, and why this is so incredibly important, and why it needs to change. You see, my friends, if we look at the population of America today, that population is approximately 330 million people. And so what ends up happening is that the majority of America's oil production ends up being consumed within the country. It's not something that ends up being exported abroad. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, has only around 10% of the population that America does, but they produce nearly as much oil, meaning they simply have far more that they could never possibly hope to consume on their own, and thus they have significantly more left over that is able to be exported to other countries. Saudi Arabia is thus by far the largest exporter of oil in the world, which is really important. And the reason that this is so important is that still, to this very day, despite the advancements that have been made in green technology, oil still manages to account for approximately a third of all energy needs for humanity. And so when you consider countries like India, China, Japan, and other states that aren't necessarily able to produce their own oil and how they need to import all of this from sources like Saudi Arabia, Arabia, that means that these very important economies are entirely dependent upon a state like Saudi Arabia keeping the oil flowing, at least for now. You see, my friends, what is interesting to note about this entire thing and the oil industry of Saudi Arabia is that the most pressing concern is not that oil is simply going to run out. It's not like that, despite, whatever it is that I'm making the title of this video. Or that it's being phased out by a green transition, where countries are trying to utilize more green energy, therefore they're not actually going to be going after oil. This is not an immediate problem, though definitely in the future it is going to become a more severe one with time. No, in fact, there are more urgent matters for one of the most important oil exporters. And that, my friends, is the actual population of Saudi Arabia. You see, one of the major considerations that is not oftentimes thought about is that Saudi Arabia, yes, produces more oil than all of its neighbors, of course, but simultaneously it has a significantly larger population, and that is something that has grown rapidly over the years to far outclips all of its neighbors. Currently, the population of Saudi Arabia sits at around 37 million people, but if you look at things back in, say, 1950 or 60, you're talking about something that only had just over 3 million people. If you want to assume, for math's sake, that you are producing maybe double the amount of oil that you were 50 or 60 years ago, but your population has increased by 10 times the amount, or in this case, over 10 times, then that would mean that that is less resources that are being split between each person for what the revenue of that oil brings. And so if you consider that Saudi Arabia produces around 12 to 13 million barrels of oil per day, then that means that they have 3.6 residents per oil barrel that is produced. Meanwhile, the United Arab Emirates has 3, Qatar has 2.1, and Kuwait has 1.6. So essentially, what that means is that in a significantly more populous country like Saudi Arabia, the larger population has to split a smaller share of the profits. And for a distributive welfare state like Saudi Arabia, that is not a good thing. And among all of the nations that we have listed, among everything in the Gulf cooperation, Saudi Arabia simultaneously has the highest poverty rate of 13.6%. In economic terms, if you go look at the GDP per capita in 2021, it was pretty much the exact same as that of 1991 in Saudi Arabia, which makes it 3 decades of economic stagnation inside of the state when you look at the prices within the state. Because of the population issue that we've already talked about, if you go and look at other petrostates, Saudi Arabia's GDP per capita is less than half that of the United Arab Emirates, which is, 20,000 and 40,000 respectively. At the same time that this is going on, producers that are outside of OPEC have taken a larger share of the market, which in turn reduces the power that the cartel effectively has. Though it accounts for close to 80% of proven reserves, it only produces around 40% of crude. Only with the addition of Russia does OPEC actually control half of global production. Which, on that note, actually brings up a very important point. Another issue for Saudi Arabia is that many countries simply do not follow targets. In recent years, members have both been unable to meet production quotas, or the reverse, deliberately gone and pumped above in order to bring in more cash flow. Some in the organization are poor countries that are in dire need of more oil revenues, so they just try to take whatever it is that they can get. And thus, at the same time that Saudi Arabia has deliberately been trying to pump up the price of oil in order to be able to make more money off of it, the US has at least been somewhat effective in limiting Saudi Arabia and Russia's efforts to boost prices to above $100 a barrel. Saudi Arabia did ultimately end up taking a pretty big hit to its finances by sacrificing production, this being in an effort to try and pump up the price of the oil that it does have. But what ultimately ended up happening inside of North America is that more oil was increased in production there, and simultaneously the United States would release from its strategic reserves, which, though it did deplete the reserves, did work in the short term of keeping oil prices down. We mentioned this earlier, but it is a really important detail that Russia specifically wants higher oil prices because it needs it in order to boost the main way that it's been able to fill its war coffers against Ukraine. The Saudis, on the other hand, because of the necessary expenses of the welfare state that they try to fund, need oil prices to be higher so that the state does not end up running into a deficit. It is really not a good thing to be dependent upon the price of oil to make sure whether or not you can actually fund your social programs that maintain the very fabric and stability of your society. And that, my friends, is where Saudi Vision 2030 comes in. Saudi Arabia is trying to fund an ambitious overhaul of the kingdom's economy. They're trying to reduce their dependence upon oil and create jobs for a young population that increasingly oil is not actually able to provide much for. And so when you combine a world that is eager to turn away from oil for whether this be political means, environmental means, or some monetary means, a growing population of young people that desire more more opportunity, as well as the rising star of what is going to be the new king of Saudi Arabia who wants to build a nation in his image, well, all of these factors end up being combined into a singular mission, that being to make Saudi Arabia thrive and no longer be dependent upon oil. That being said, 2030 is not just about removing dependency upon oil. It's about specifically transforming society inside of Saudi Arabia, making it capable of modifying itself to the changes that are going to occur in the modern world, whether that be for oil or literally anything else that could come towards it. But time really is ticking for Saudi Arabia. It has been 8 years since they went and announced Vision 2030 in the first place. They are past the midway point of their timeline, and with just 6 years left to finish that race, we don't really know what exactly is going to happen. It means that the kingdom has to get more serious than it ever has, or it's going to risk falling behind. And this entire massive project is all the brainchild of the individual that we talked about before with the Saudi royal family, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Within the scope of what it is that he wants to do with the country, there are many different moving parts, but the standout feature, the thing that probably is more insane than anything else about Saudi Vision 2030, is the mega projects that it wants to create, or in this case, even grander than mega projects, they are giga projects. Now, my friends, there are many of these different projects that we can go and talk about, and honestly, this is a thing that I think that this channel would probably love to get into in the first place, is talking about mega projects, both the ones that were proposed to happen, the ones that did happen, and the ones that failed horribly. But in this case, for Saudi Arabia, the crown jewel project that we are talking about is NEOM. This being something that would take place in the country's northwestern corner, NEOM's centerpiece is supposed to be a $1 trillion megacity known as The Line. And I'm sure that when I'm talking about this, that we can definitely pull up some of the promotional content that talks about The Line, but oh my god, you people need to understand the sheer scope of what we are talking about here. Early renderings of The Line show a vast mirror-like structure in the desert, set about 650 feet wide and 100 miles long. Saudi Arabia has stated that the cutting-edge car-free city is going to run on 100%, not oil, renewable energy, and will put services all within a 5-minute walk of 9 million people. In other words, the line that we are talking about here symbolizes basically everything that Saudi Arabia is setting out to achieve over the course of Vision 2030. It wants to commit itself to a future that is free of oil, to build livable spaces with economic opportunity for its young and very mobile population, and it wants to set the standard for the world of a futuristic city that everyone around them could be able to emulate. Will it happen? Well, that probably needs to be another video. Another thing that 2030 is supposed to be doing is allowing more resources to be harvested in greater amounts than simply oil, as Saudi Arabia, weirdly enough, actually has a decent amount of mineral resources that have yet to be tapped into. In fact, what has happened recently is that Saudi Arabia just this year nearly doubled the estimate for the value of its mineral resources, and from that is seeing very lucrative deals being signed. Estimates for the kingdom's untapped mineral reserves have jumped from an estimated $1.3 trillion, which they forecast back in 2016, to doubling to $2.5 trillion. This all being according to Saudi Mineral Resource and Industry Minister Bandar Al-Karyef. The resources that we are talking about include gold, copper, phosphate, and rare earth elements. This being things that would offer new sources of subterranean wealth on top of Saudi Arabia's mammoth oil reserves. Saudi Arabia has developed over 33 new exploration sites for mining, and it aims to award foreign investors more than 30 mining exploration licenses over the course of 2024. And this is insane, but there is even more that they are doing, and this is probably the thing that more people have heard about in the news. Because what Saudi Arabia has done is put in absolutely ludicrously lavish investments on sports, with some people saying that it is just simply sports washing their image by trying to spend ridiculous amounts of money in an effort to have people be distracted from their terrible human rights cases, with over $6.3 billion being spent since 2021. This includes doing things like buying clubs overseas and paying an estimated $214 million for the football player Cristiano Ronaldo. We don't know the exact amount that has been spent, but we do know that Saudi Arabia has at least spent over $6 billion. And that number that we are talking about, $6.3 billion, that is more than quadruple the previous amount that was spent over a 6-year period. So mind you, over $6 billion that were spent from 2021 in comparison to $1.5 billion that was spent in the previous previous years from 2015 all the way through 2021. That's a big increase. We are talking about investments of such a scale that it has completely changed professional golf and transformed the international transfer market for football. The Saudi Arabian club Al Hilal submitted a world record bid for the French captain Kylian Mbappe, understood to be worth 300 million euro. And I know that a number of people are probably going to think, okay, yeah, $6.3 billion, that is a lot. That's definitely a lot. But how big is it? Well, to put that into perspective, that is pretty much the GDP of the entire country of Montenegro or the island of Barbados, and it is spent on sports. As a result of this and more, different human rights groups across the world, such as Amnesty International, have accused Saudi Arabia then of sports washing their image, of trying to bankroll big-name sporting events in order to distract the public from their very poor record on human rights. And if that sounds like an odd statement, then no, hear me out on this. After the 2018 murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, Saudi Arabia was broadly shunned by the public, with many major corporations withdrawing or pausing investment into the country. In addition to that, every time they made some kind of offer to a sports player of some type, typically this was something that ended up being refused. But there has been a bit of a shift in moral stances as the amount of money that is now offered by the Saudis has drastically increased in the past half decade. As an example of one of these things, back in October of 2021, the football team Newcastle United was bought for $391 million. Many different human rights groups were noticeably upset by this and criticized the club after leaked images showed changes to its away kit that would match the colors of the Saudi national team. A year later, the Public Investment Fund would state its intention to spend $2.3 billion on football sponsorships. This would include massive unspecified investments to buy majority stakes in 4 different Saudi Arabian football teams, and the 4 clubs would spend lavishly in order to try and attract players from around the world, particularly Al Nassr, which would sign the star football player Cristiano Ronaldo for a reported $200 million annually, making him the world's highest paid athlete. Ronaldo's signing would be then followed by a host of other stars and coaches, including Karim Benzema from Real Madrid, N'Golo Kante from Chelsea, Roberto Firmino from Liverpool, and the former Aston Villa manager Steven Gerrard. I'm sure that many of you watching are probably familiar with the image behind me right here. The footballer Lionel Messi is reportedly paid an estimated $25 million by the Saudi Arabian Tourism Authority for his promotion to the country, including posting about lavish trips on social media. He received an offer from Al Hilal of $350 million, but ultimately actually ended up refusing that and instead chose the US MLS team Inter Miami. So that's interesting. Keeping on the whole football train, Saudi Arabia would then announce that it was actually going to be the one that would host the 2034 FIFA Club World Cup. One can only imagine the sheer amount of financial investments that are going to need to be made in order to create all the football stadiums and everything that will be required for it. Moving on to another sport, the Public Investment Fund would also make major investments that would completely upend golf as a sport. And now, perhaps, it makes Saudi Arabia the most influential force in the entire sport itself. In October of 2021, the fund would invest an estimated $2 billion in order to create LIV Golf, a major golf tournament. The move would set off a bitter rivalry with the PGA Tour, which would take legal action, claiming that the Saudi-funded project was trying to lure players to breach their existing commitments. One lawsuit would even accuse LIV of a campaign to use, quote, astronomical sums of money in an effort to use the LIV players and the game of golf to sports wash the recent history of Saudi atrocities and to further the Saudi Public Investment Fund's initiatives. And this all sounds incredibly dramatic, and it would end in equally dramatic fashion with an effective takeover of the PGA to create a conglomerate to dominate professional golf. Moving on from sports, in May 2016, a general authority for entertainment was announced by royal decree, into which over $2 billion would be invested. In Riyadh, the first public live music concert for over 25 years was held in May 2017, this being one that featured American country musician Toby Keith. Yes, my friends, that is right. There was not a single live concert in Saudi Arabia for 25 years, and they bring it back with an American country music star. And in addition to that, the government would go on to announce a 334 square kilometer sports, culture, and entertainment complex at Al Qadiyah, somewhere that is southwest of Riyadh. The project was also set to include a Six Flags theme park that was supposed to open in 2022, but that ultimately didn't end up happening. There's still been many delays since then, and that's one of the things that we're probably going to get into here later. As another component to Vision 2030, there would be a celebration of the 87th anniversary of the founding of the country, with concerts and performances being, well, performed. Women were, during this time period, for the first time actually allowed into King Fahd's International Stadium there in the capital city of Riyadh. Which, yes, that is something that happened for the first time. Women's rights and Saudi Arabia, that is a whole other can of worms. Which brings me to my next point, and I absolutely have to mention this, which a number of people are going to wonder, well, why would I be talking about women's rights in Saudi Arabia and then move on to an image of wrestling? Well, trust me on this, you're going to want to hear this. On the 5th of March, 2018, the General Sports Authority would announce a 10-year partnership with American professional wrestling promoter World Wrestling Entertainment, like WWE, to hold annual pay-per-view events in Saudi Arabia. The first event, the Greatest Royal Rumble, was held on the 27th of April, 2018 at King Abdullah Sports City in Jeddah. But due to restriction on women's rights, possibly because of, some other things that were going on at the time in Saudi Arabia, WWE's female performers were initially not actually allowed to perform in these events. But the first exception to this would end up occurring at the Crown Jewel on the 31st of October 2019, which would feature Lacey Evans and Natalya in the first women's professional wrestling match to be held in Saudi Arabia. Because go figure, that wasn't something that was typically done. An observation, though, of course, of the more conservative culture, both women were required to wear black leggings as well as t-shirts over bodysuits instead of the normal ring attire that they would have been wearing. Women's matches have now been featured on the event ever since. In addition to that, Saudi Arabia would simultaneously during this time period lift its 35-year ban on the construction of new movie theaters in the country, with the first new theater owned by AMC Theaters opening on 18th of April 2018 in Riyadh. And in 2019, it would announce the launch date of the Red Sea Film Festival, which in later 2023 would feature Hollywood stars such as Will Smith and Johnny Depp who would attend. Another thing that was also done during this time period was that in 2019, a winter festival known as Riyadh Season was first held, including various concerts, entertainment events, attractions, and cultural pavilions, such as the MDL Beast Soundstorm Electronic Music Festival, which is not something that you would normally anticipate to happen in Saudi Arabia. At the same time, the country's first official New Year's Eve event would occur at Boulevard Riyadh City. Even over the course of doing research for this video, what I found is that right now, in February of 2024, the time that I am researching and making this thing, the Riyadh Season would include various different entertainment sports events, such as The Last Dance, which was a football match that featured Lionel Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo. Like moving back in here on sports. I can only imagine how putting them together would have been incredibly expensive. Moving on to even more investments, in January of 2020, Saudi Arabia would unveil plans to build a new racing circuit in Qiddiya, designed by former Formula One driver Alexander Wurz. In November of 2020, it was announced that another circuit was being developed in Jeddah to host the inaugural Saudi Arabian Grand Prix that would occur in 2021. I'm sure that for anyone who has been watching this video right now, that if you are listening to everything that I have been saying, I am only scratching the surface of what it is that Saudi Arabia has done or plans to do during this time period. But really, not everything is necessarily about insane grand investments into things like sports. I did say that I would mention women's rights, and that is actually something that Saudi Arabia has worked on, at least to a degree, in this time period, something that is also part of the 2030 vision. Historically speaking, Saudi Arabia doesn't exactly have the greatest track record on human rights, and even less when it comes to women's rights. But in early 2017, Saudi state schools would announce that they would be offering physical education classes, that's right, gym classes, to both boys and girls, starting in the fall of 2017. Later that year, the state would also go on to announce that they would allow women to attend sporting events, things that they weren't actually allowed to do before, like they're actually allowed to now go inside of sports stadiums. On the 26th of September 2017, a royal decree was issued that, amazingly enough, granted women the ability to drive vehicles, something that would take place in June of 2018. That's right, women before were not allowed to drive. I know that what it is that I am talking about here seems like very small things, like things that were obvious that should have absolutely happened, but that's just it. For Saudi Arabia, for many years, they hadn't. And while these changes in the law were implemented specifically for the welfare of women and to develop a growing workforce in the future, simultaneously, there is still a lot of progress that would need to be made. And even more negative things have happened during this time period that kind of resets the proverbial clock, if you will. And I don't think that that there is any finer example of that, if you want something of historical significance to talk about, than the application AbShare, something that gained severe media attention back in 2019 as it was criticized for tracking the movement of women within the kingdom. Yes, this is something that really brings Saudi Arabia and its rights system into the 21st century with modern technology. The app, which promotes a male guardianship system, allows men to manage women's lives digitally by specifying where and when a woman can travel. So if a woman says that she's going to the market, and then you check and see and says she's actually, the street over by the market, that's tracking their positions, right? At the same time, what the app is going to do is it actually allows a feature to provide a notification to a man's phone if a woman uses her passport at the border. The European Parliament and United States Congress condemned the app and encouraged the kingdom to abolish its male guardianship system, but it's Saudi Arabia, and that's not necessarily happening. But hey, you know what? At least in August of 2019, Saudi Arabia would manage to lift travel restrictions on women and would grant greater control to those that were above the age of 21. And if we then go and look at the early 2020s, then 30% of the workforce actually was then at that point composed of females, which was actually one of the goals for Saudi Vision 2030. So hey, at least that's one aspect that is done, which I suppose is something that would actually help when foreign women would come into Saudi Arabia, and that is something that they are actively encouraging. To advance the Saudi Vision 2030, Saudi Arabia would formally announce on the 27th of September 2019 to issue tourist visas, things that would allow visitors from 49 different countries to visit the country up to 90 days for a fee of $80. The visa can either be obtained online or upon arrival. From everything that we have talked about, Saudi Arabia is very obviously launching a very desperate and real effort, something that is massive, but the question becomes, will it actually work? Over 300 specific targets for 2020 alone had been announced across 25 different government entities as part of the National Transformation Plan. The NTP brings over 150 expected initial public offerings. However, reports note that all of this really depends on key individuals, such as Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And if something would happen to him, or if he would become incapacitated, then everything really grinds to a halt. Simultaneously, despite all of the plans that have been announced, no one really has any real transparency about what is actually happening, how long things would actually take, how much actual money is being used. There is very little transparency in any regard. A number of journalists have already speculated that the plan's goals were from the beginning overly ambitious, and they've noted that non-oil growth so far has been insufficient and would threaten the plan's successful implementation. Even if the plan is something that does at least help the economy of Saudi Arabia moving forward, the backwards political system, the backwards bureaucracy, the social reforms that are lacking with the country, all of these things are going to be issues that are going to hold the plan back. We haven't really even gone into the detail of a lot of these things, but the structural disadvantages of the country, such as weak institutions, inefficient bureaucracy, significant skill gaps between labor demands and the education system, all of these things are issues that are going to hinder the growth prospects of the country. And trying to rebalance the job market in private sector, of actually having private industry be able to develop within the country, this is going to be a severe challenge, as the majority of people who are working in that position are actually not Saudi Arabians. They're not Saudis. As one can imagine from everything it is that we have talked about here, the public sector is really the most lucrative aspect of Saudi Arabia. That is something that is typically tied to the oil industry, and that means that is where you're going to be able to make your most money. Since the private jobs that work the other things that are necessary for daily life in Saudi Arabia don't really make as much, this means that mostly they have to look to the outside, from aspects from Africa, from Asia, from other regions that are willing to accept lower salaries that are easier to hire and then fire. Currently, as we are talking about this, there are twice as many Saudi nationals working in the public sector as there are in the private sector. The challenge really lies in getting a larger portion of nationals to accept lower paying jobs with more hours than typical public jobs, and that's not something that people really want to do. The private sector must also be moved away from business activities that require very low cost labor and actually develop into semi or even very skilled labor. In addition to that internal division, the country itself of Saudi Arabia is also internally divided, as we have already talked about when it comes to tribes. The developments that we are talking about here that are required to increase GDP as planned, this is something that with time is going to hopefully encourage the breaking of the tribal system within Saudi Arabia. Because another aspect that is going to be very difficult about this is the zero tolerance to corruption within 2030, and that is exceptionally difficult to achieve in a society where family, your tribe, your regional ties, these are things that are typically stronger than any kind of national identity. People, generally within Saudi Arabia, Arabia do not see themselves as Saudis first, but rather members of their tribe and family first. And so it is then into this harsh reality that Saudi Arabia has approved its 2024 budget, something which forecasts a fiscal deficit of 79 billion riyals, or $21 billion. One may argue that going into a deficit in order to be able to fuel the growth necessary to change the country over from its specific oil-dependent economy is necessary, but whether or not that's actually going to succeed, well, we don't really know. Right now, the plan as it is operating at a loss. Whether it will work remains to be seen. But whatever happens, no matter how much it is drilled, no matter how much it is pumped, the future of oil in Saudi Arabia is no longer set in stone. Everyone, my friends, this has been Stakuyi with the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. Thank you very much for watching. I ask that you like, comment, subscribe, and I know that at some point in this video I'm going to have to insert something else there to just say that, so I'm going to add that in. This is possibly one of the longest videos that I've worked on here in quite a while, and I hope to God that the YouTube gods are kind to me when this goes out. I know that these kinds of topics are things that are not typically friendly on YouTube, so all of your support, if you actually watched here to the end, is something that I greatly appreciate. Thank you all very much, and I will see you all next time. Make sure to let me know in the comment section below what it is that we should talk about next. Goodbye, my friends, and we'll see you next time.